What if the most powerful beings ever created stood just beyond the veil of human sight, watching the crucifixion unfold in absolute silence, not because they were powerless, but because they were commanded to restrain themselves? As nails were driven into the flesh of the Son of God, and darkness swallowed the land at midday, heaven did not intervene. Angels who had once shaken mountains, shut the mouths of lions, and destroyed armies were forced to stand still. Every instinct to act was overridden by a higher command. While earth descended into chaos and sorrow, heaven held its breath. Something was happening at the cross that even angels struggled to comprehend, a mystery older than creation itself. This was not defeat. This was not failure. This was the cost of salvation being paid in full, and every realm of existence was watching. Imagine a silence so heavy it feels alive, a pause so absolute that even eternity seems to hold its breath. Before there was a cross planted into dry earth, before iron pierced flesh, before blood traced lines down wood shaped by human hands, there was heaven watching, not watching with indifference, not with confusion alone, but with a depth of attention that had never before been required of them. For ages uncounted, the angels had known order, worship, movement, command. They had known glory as atmosphere, obedience as instinct, praise as breath. They had never known helplessness, and yet now, at the edge of history's most decisive hour, helplessness was precisely what they were commanded to embrace. To understand the weight of that moment, one must understand who these beings were, long before a hill called Golgotha ever bore a name. Angels were not ornamental figures drifting through clouds, not fragile symbols of comfort. They were ancient intelligences, forged before time as humans would ever measure it, radiant with purpose and strength. They had witnessed the birth of light, had seen space stretch outward at a word, had heard oceans roar into existence. When the foundations of the world were laid, they were already singing. Creation was not a mystery to them, it was an event they attended. They had never doubted the authority of the one who spoke reality into being, never questioned the supremacy of the Son through whom all things were made. They knew him first as word, as command, as creative fire. They had seen him shape stars without strain, sustain worlds without effort. His authority was not learned, it simply was. To the angels, power had always flowed outward from him effortlessly, like light from a flame. And so, when the unimaginable happened, when that same eternal word stepped into time, not as ruler but as infant, their understanding of reality was already being stretched. They announced his birth with songs too large for shepherds to fully grasp, filling the night sky with glory that barely fit within human senses. Yet even then, they did not understand everything. They were learning, watching something unfold that had been planned long before they themselves had been created. For decades they observed quietly as the Son of God lived a life bounded by human limits. They saw him stumble as a child learning to walk, labor under the sun with rough hands shaped by wood and work, grow tired, hungry, and misunderstood. They watched him heal with a touch that cost him nothing, and yet meant everything to those who received it. They witnessed storms silenced by a voice they recognized, demons flee from authority they had always known as supreme, and still, nothing prepared them for what was coming. All of that power restrained, all of that authority contained within a body that could bleed. The shift was subtle at first, felt more than announced. The tone of heaven changed as the final weeks approached. There was a gravity in the Son's words that the angels recognized immediately, because they had heard echoes of it in prophecies spoken centuries before. They had heard the promises, had seen the visions given to prophets who trembled under their weight. They knew the language of sacrifice, of suffering, of a servant wounded for others, but knowledge and reality are not the same. Watching prophecy breathe is different than guarding its words. As the Son spoke more openly of his death, heaven listened, not with surprise but with growing tension. The angels understood obedience better than any other beings in existence. Their loyalty was not forced, it was absolute because it was aligned with truth. Yet now obedience would require something unprecedented, restraint. They were beings accustomed to action. They had shut lions' mouths, shattered prison doors, struck down armies, delivered messages that altered nations. Intervention was what they did. Protection was their instinct. And now, as the threat against their Lord intensified, the command from the Father was not to prepare for battle, but to wait. The night in the garden was the breaking point. When the Son withdrew to pray, the angels followed at a distance unseen, sensing the weight pressing down upon him. This was not the sorrow of fear alone. It was the compression of destiny. He was being pressed like olives beneath stone, the weight of human sin converging on a single point in time. They watched as his body reacted to anguish so extreme that blood mingled with sweat, something they had never seen in all their observation of creation. It was suffering beyond physical pain. It was anticipation of separation, something angels themselves had never experienced. And then came the order. One angel was sent, not an army, not a legion, one. That detail mattered. Thousands would have rushed forward without hesitation if allowed, but heaven operates not on impulse, but command. The angel who descended did not come to remove the burden, but to strengthen him to carry it. That alone rewrote everything the angels thought they understood about strength. They were watching omnipotence accept assistance, not to escape pain, but to endure it. As the Son rose from prayer and walked toward betrayal, heaven watched every step. Each footfall echoed with finality. When the mob arrived armed and shouting, the angels felt the tension snap tight. One word, just one, and the earth would have cracked under the arrival of overwhelming force. The Son himself acknowledged it, speaking of legions ready at a prayer. The angels were already aligned, already waiting, already restrained by a command they did not fully understand, but would never disobey. The arrest unfolded with a speed that felt wrong. The Creator bound by rope, the judge standing silently before flawed courts. The angels observed every blow, every false accusation, every moment where truth was swallowed by noise. Silence became the most confusing weapon of all. They had seen him speak and worlds obey. Now he chose not to speak, and injustice reigned unchecked. It was not weakness. They knew that, but knowing did not make watching easier. As the night stretched toward morning, the angels began to understand that this was not merely about human cruelty or political fear. Something far deeper was unfolding. This was not chaos, it was precision. Pain was not interrupting the plan, it was the plan. Every insult absorbed, every lash endured, every breath labored was moving history toward an outcome only God could have designed. Still, understanding did not erase anguish. To witness perfection suffer willingly is to feel tension beyond logic. By the time the sun rose and the cross was prepared, heaven was silent in a way it had never been before. No songs, no proclamations, no thunderous movement, just watchfulness. The angels who had once filled skies with praise now stood still, their focus fixed on a single hill outside a city that did not recognize what it was about to do. The sun moved forward, under the weight of wood he had once designed into existence, and the angels followed, unseen, constrained, waiting, knowing that once the first nail was struck, there would be no turning back. They did not yet see the end. They did not yet understand how death itself would be undone. They only knew that love was being expressed in a form so severe it would redefine the universe. And so they watched, faithful, silent, obedient, as the story entered its darkest hour, not knowing how light would return, only trusting that it would. Heaven had never known a command like this. Stand down, observe, do not intervene. The order did not echo with anger or uncertainty. It was precise, deliberate, unyielding. For beings whose very existence was defined by movement at God's word, restraint felt unnatural. Angels were created to act, to go, to deliver, to defend. Yet now, as the Son of God was led through the streets of Jerusalem under false charges and rising hatred, their swords remained sheathed, their power contained, their obedience tested in a way it never had been before. From the unseen realm, they watched the night unravel. Torches flickered against stone walls, casting distorted shadows that danced like mockery across ancient streets. Voices overlapped in accusation and fear. The religious leaders, meant to shepherd truth, had hardened themselves into instruments of injustice. The angels recognized the pattern. They had seen it before. Truth resisted, light rejected, pride disguised as righteousness. But never had the stakes been this high. Never had the target been the one they had worshipped for eternity. Inside the halls of judgment, lies stacked upon lies. False witnesses contradicted each other, their words collapsing under their own weight, yet still the trial pressed forward. The angels saw every inconsistency, every twisted motive, every clenched jaw, fueled by envy rather than justice. They watched as the sun stood silent, absorbing accusation without defense. This silence unsettled them more than any blow could have. Speech had always been his instrument. Through speech, worlds were formed. Through speech, demons fled. Now he chose quiet. It was a silence not of defeat, but of surrender to a purpose far larger than the moment. When the sun finally rose, it did not bring clarity. It brought escalation. The trial shifted from religious theater to political calculation. Pilate stood before a man he knew was innocent, and a crowd he feared might turn violent. The angels sensed the imbalance. Immediately, human authority, fragile and self-preserving, was now tasked with judging divine innocence. The outcome was never truly in doubt, but the process was painful to watch. Justice faltered under pressure, and truth was weighed against convenience, and found expendable. Scourging came next. The angels had seen human suffering before, but this was different. Roman discipline was brutal by design, meant to break bodies and spirits alike. The whip tore flesh, each strike carving prophecy into skin. They knew the words written centuries earlier, knew their meaning, but seeing them etched in real time felt unbearable. Every lash was unnecessary from a human perspective, yet essential from a divine one. The son did not resist. He did not call out. He bore it all, not as victim, but as offering. Mockery followed pain, as it so often does. A crown of thorns pressed into his scalp, blood tracing paths down his face. A robe draped over torn shoulders, a reed placed in his hand. Laughter echoed where reverence should have stood. The angels felt the irony like a wound. The true king clothed in humiliation by those who owed him their breath. They could have ended it. They knew it. The mockers did not. And still, heaven remained silent. The march to execution began under a sky that seemed indifferent, yet the angels sensed creation itself responding. The wood pressed into his shoulders was heavy, but not heavier than the weight he carried within. Sin, guilt, rebellion, layers of human failure converged upon him with every step. When he stumbled, angels moved instinctively, ready to intervene, but the command held. Instead, a man was compelled to help, flesh assisting flesh, while heaven watched, restrained. The hill rose ahead, stark and exposed. Golgotha, a place shaped by death, marked by history, destined for this moment long before a name was given to it. As the sun was laid upon the wood, time itself seemed to slow. The angels felt it, a pause in the rhythm of existence. The hammer rose, iron met flesh. The sound reverberated beyond earth, beyond sky, through realms unseen. Nails secured wrists and feet, binding the author of life to a device of execution. When the cross was lifted, pain intensified, breath became labor, gravity became enemy. Every movement cost agony. The angels observed the mechanics of suffering with an attention sharpened by helplessness. They understood the physical reality, how the body struggled against its own weight, how each breath required strength drained by pain. Yet what unfolded on the cross was not merely physical. It was spiritual, cosmic, eternal. From the height of the cross, the Son spoke, not in condemnation, not in demand, in forgiveness. Father, forgive them. The angels reeled at the words. Forgiveness extended at the height of injustice. Mercy offered, while pain still surged. They had seen mercy before. They had delivered it, guarded it, enforced its boundaries. But this was mercy unfiltered, unconditional, poured out at the moment of greatest offense. It redefined everything they thought they knew about love. Hours passed. The crowd shifted between boredom and cruelty. Soldiers gambled for clothing that belonged to the one who owned all things. Religious leaders scoffed, mistaking restraint for inability. The angels recognized the fatal misunderstanding. He could save himself. That was never in question. He chose not to. The distinction mattered more than anyone present could comprehend. Darkness fell at noon. Not the gentle dimming of evening, but an unnatural shroud that swallowed light itself. The angels understood immediately. This was not weather, this was judgment. Sin had reached its fullest expression, and creation responded accordingly. During those hours, heaven was more silent than it had ever been. No song rose, no command echoed. Even the angels who thrived in God's presence felt the weight of separation descend like a veil. What happened during that darkness stretched beyond their comprehension. The Son bore something angels had never known: separation from the Father. They had always seen unity, perfect, eternal, unbroken. Now they witnessed fracture, not in essence, but in experience. The cost of sin was being paid in full, not with coin or sacrifice, but with abandonment. The angels felt the gravity of it without fully grasping its depth. Some mysteries are meant to be witnessed before they are understood. When the cry came, raw, anguished, ancient, it cut through the darkness like a blade. A question voiced from prophecy now lived in reality. Heaven trembled. The angels had never heard the Son speak like this. It was not doubt. It was agony. The full weight of humanity's separation from God compressed into a single moment, expressed in a voice that had once called stars into existence. And then something shifted. The darkness began to lift. The cry of abandonment gave way to completion. It is finished. The angels understood instantly. This was not resignation. It was declaration. The debt was paid, the work accomplished. What began before time had now reached its climax within time. When the Son surrendered his spirit, the earth responded violently. Rocks split, the ground shook, the veil tore, barriers fell, access was opened. The angels watched as creation mourned and celebrated simultaneously. Death had claimed its victim, but only temporarily. They sensed it, even if they did not yet see how it would unfold. This was not the end. It could not be. The silence that followed was different from the one before. It was not tense. It was expectant. The body was taken down, wrapped, laid in stone, sealed by human authority that did not realize how fragile its power truly was. As night fell again, angels remained vigilant. Orders had not changed, still no intervention, still no song. But beneath the stillness, something moved. Victory had been secured, even if its announcement was yet to come. Heaven waited, not in despair, but in certainty. The cross had done its work. What remained was resurrection. Saturday arrived without sunrise in heaven. Time moved forward on earth, but in the unseen realm it felt suspended, as though the universe itself was holding a breath it had never before needed to hold. The Son of God lay motionless in a borrowed tomb, wrapped in linen, sealed behind stone and human certainty. For the angels, this was the most disorienting reality they had ever faced. They had seen death claim kings, prophets, warriors, and children. They had escorted countless righteous souls beyond the veil. But they had never seen death touch the author of life. It was like watching the source of light disappear and being told that darkness was now in charge. Heaven was quiet, but it was not empty. Angels remained at their posts, attentive, aware, restrained. Obedience still governed every movement, but now obedience required waiting without clarity. The Father had not explained everything. Some details were withheld, not out of secrecy, but because even angelic minds could not yet fully process what was unfolding. For beings accustomed to understanding orders in full, this partial knowledge was itself a new experience. Faith was being demanded not only of humans, but of angels as well. On earth, grief moved like fog. The disciples scattered, hiding behind locked doors, replaying moments they wished they could undo. Words spoken too quickly, promises broken under fear, silence where courage should have stood. The angels observed them with a kind of sorrowful compassion. These men had walked with the Son, eaten with him, heard his voice daily, and yet now they believed the story had ended in failure. They had not yet learned what angels were beginning to sense, that endings in God's design are often only veils. The women who had followed Jesus moved differently. Their grief was heavy, but it carried purpose. They remembered where the body had been laid. They planned to return. Love compelled action, even when hope felt thin. The angels noticed this distinction. They had watched human history long enough to know that devotion often survives where certainty collapses. These women did not understand resurrection yet, but they understood loyalty. That mattered more than they knew. Meanwhile, the religious leaders did not rest. Fear drove them even in victory. They remembered the sun's words about rising again, words spoken plainly but dismissed until now. The irony was not lost on the angels. Enemies remembered the promise more clearly than friends. Seals were placed, guards assigned, authority asserted. Human power stacked itself against divine intent, unaware of how fragile it truly was. The angels observed this with a mixture of patience and quiet certainty. Stones and soldiers had never been obstacles to God. They were props in a drama whose outcome was already decided. Beneath the surface of stillness, something extraordinary was happening. The sun was not inactive. Though his body rested in the tomb, his spirit moved with purpose. Angels sensed it more than they saw it, like a current beneath calm water. Ancient boundaries were being crossed. Places untouched since the dawn of rebellion were now being confronted by the very presence of redemption. The victory of the cross was not limited to earth. Its reach extended into realms humans rarely consider. The angels did not fully understand this phase. They knew the justice of God. They knew rebellion had consequences. They knew there were beings who had rejected light long ago and were confined as a result. But now the sun himself was engaging realities that even angels approached with reverence. This was not battle in the way they understood battle. There were no swords, no clashes of force. It was proclamation. Declaration. The announcement that what had been lost was now reclaimed, that death's claim had been challenged at its deepest root. Saturday stretched on, heavy and strange. Heaven did not sing. The absence of praise was not rebellion, it was reverence. Angels waited, because they had been taught that some moments are too sacred for sound. They remembered creation, when light first burst forth at command. This felt similar, but inverted. Then light emerged from nothing. Now light had entered darkness to claim it from within. The Father reigned silent, not distant, but deliberate. Silence, the angels were learning, was sometimes the final form of trust. Everything that needed to be done had been done. The cross was sufficient. Nothing could be added to it. Nothing needed correction. What remained was timing, and timing belonged to God alone. As the hours passed, anticipation grew, not anxious, but electric. Angels began to sense movement in heaven's order. Positions subtly adjusted. Attention sharpened. It was not yet action, but preparation. They had waited through creation, through covenants, through centuries of promise. Waiting a little longer was not hardship. Yet this waiting was different. It carried certainty. Death had not won. It had overreached. Earth slept unaware. The sealed tomb stood silent in a garden that did not yet know it was about to become the most famous place in history. The stone held nothing captive. It merely concealed glory for a moment longer. Angels stationed nearby did not guard the tomb to keep someone in, but to bear witness to what would soon be revealed. They were not defenders of death, but heralds of life waiting for their cue. In the deepest hours before dawn, heaven's silence changed texture. It was no longer stillness, it was expectancy. Orders began to flow, clear and unmistakable. The restraint that had defined the last days was about to be lifted. The angels felt it ripple through their ranks like electricity. After centuries of watching, after days of enforced inaction, they were about to move, not to fight, not to rescue, but to announce. Death's authority was ending. The grave had reached beyond its jurisdiction. The sun was about to rise, not assisted, not summoned, but by his own power. Angels would not roll back the stone to let him out. He did not need an exit. They would roll it back so the world could see it was empty. Saturday was ending. The longest silence in history was about to give way to proclamation. Heaven was ready, earth was not, but it would be. The moment before dawn has a distinct quality, a fragile tension where night still claims dominion, but light has already decided to return. On that morning, creation itself seemed to lean forward into that threshold. The earth was quiet, unaware that the axis of history had already shifted beneath its surface. Heaven, however, was fully awake. The waiting was over. The command moved through the unseen realm with unmistakable clarity. Act, not enforce, not in vengeance, in revelation. The angels who had stood silent through betrayal, torture, and death now felt purpose surge through them again, not the familiar purpose of intervention, but the sacred task of announcement. This was not a rescue mission. It was a declaration that rescue had already been accomplished. One angel descended first, radiant with authority not borrowed but assigned. His presence disturbed the natural order, as effortlessly as breath disturbs still water. The ground responded before human eyes could register what was happening. Stones shook, seals cracked. The earth itself acknowledged a higher command than Rome's authority. The stone was rolled away not with struggle, but with casual certainty, as if gravity itself had been briefly overruled. The angel sat upon it, not from exhaustion, but as a statement. Power had shifted. Control had changed hands. The guards never stood a chance. These were not weak men, nor inexperienced ones. They were trained for violence, hardened by bloodshed, disciplined by fear of punishment. But they had never encountered holiness unfiltered. Terror seized them not because the angel threatened them, but because truth had arrived unannounced. Their bodies collapsed under a reality their training could not prepare them for. They lived, but only barely, frozen between consciousness and dread. Inside the tomb, there was no body to defend, no miracle to initiate. The resurrection had already occurred. No angel had breathed life back into the sun. No external force had pulled him from death. Life had returned because it belonged to him by right. Death had no legal authority to hold him. The stone was never a barrier to resurrection. It was a barrier to witnesses until the appointed moment. As the sky lightened and footsteps approached along the garden path, heaven focused its attention on a small group of women, carrying spices and sorrow in equal measure. They walked with practical concerns, discussing stones and obstacles, unaware that the greatest obstacle in human history had already been removed. Their grief had not prepared them for wonder, but it had not disqualified them from it either. When they arrived and saw the stone moved, confusion replaced sorrow. Loss gives grief a structure, mystery dissolves it. Inside the tomb, angels waited, not in ambush, not in secrecy, but in plain sight. Their appearance was intentional. Humanity's first witnesses of resurrection would not encounter emptiness alone. Heaven would speak. The message was simple, but its implications were infinite. He is not here. He is risen. No elaboration, no explanation of mechanics, no theological lecture. Resurrection was not a concept to be debated. It was a reality to be proclaimed. The angels did not invite the women to understand. It would take a lifetime for that. They invited them to see. The place where death had been expected was empty. The absence itself was evidence. Fear and joy collided within them, emotions not meant to coexist but now inseparable. They were told to go, to speak, to announce what angels had waited days to declare. In this, heaven revealed another reversal. Angels were not sent to preach to the world. Humans were. Heaven would entrust earth with the message of heaven's greatest victory. As the women ran, the angels watched the ripple begin. Truth always moves outward once released. It cannot remain contained. It disturbs expectations, fractures certainty, demands response. Even disbelief would be part of its spread. The angels understood this well. They had seen how revelation unsettles before it transforms. Elsewhere in the garden, one woman lingered. Grief had slowed her steps. Loss had narrowed her vision. When she encountered the risen sun, she did not recognize him at first. Angels observed this with gentle understanding. Resurrection was too much for the human mind to process instantly. Glory can be mistaken for the ordinary when expectation has been buried alongside hope. One word changed everything. Her name, spoken with familiarity untouched by death. Recognition flooded in, collapsing sorrow into joy so intense it was almost unbearable. The angels saw something new then, not resurrection itself, but its immediate effect. Death did not just reverse, it healed. Identity was restored. Relationship resumed. Love continued uninterrupted, as if death had been an inconvenient pause rather than a final word. Throughout that day and the days that followed, angels watched the risen sun move among his followers in a form both familiar and transformed. He bore wounds, not as injuries, but as testimony. He ate, spoke, walked, appeared, vanished. Physical laws obeyed him in new ways, not because they had changed, but because his relationship to them had. He was no longer subject to death, yet fully present in life. Fear dissolved gradually among the disciples, replaced by astonishment, then conviction. Each appearance layered certainty upon doubt until disbelief became impossible. The angels observed this patiently. Faith, they knew, grows through encounter. Humans needed to see, to touch, to hear. The Son accommodated this without rebuke. His victory was not fragile. It could withstand scrutiny. What fascinated the angels most was not the power of resurrection, but its purpose. The Son did not rise to reclaim political authority or punish his enemies. He rose to commission, to entrust fragile humans with a message that would outlast empires, to promise presence rather than dominance, to redefine power as transformation rather than control. When he spoke of going to the ends of the earth, angels understood that their own role was shifting. They would no longer be the primary messengers. Humans would carry the story, flawed and fearful though they were. Angels would assist, protect, guide, but the voice would be human. The gospel would be preached not by beings of light, but by those who had been rescued from darkness. As the Son prepared to ascend, heaven stirred once more. This was a return, but not a reversal. He would not resume his place as though nothing had happened. He returned bearing humanity with him, wounds and all. The angels recognized the magnitude of this moment. Heaven would never again be untouched by earth. The throne itself now bore the mark of sacrifice. When he rose from their sight, angels filled the space he left, not to replace him, but to explain. The story was not ending, it was expanding. The same Jesus who ascended would return. History was now moving toward another appointed moment, one angels would again witness with awe. As heaven received the Son, celebration erupted, not in ignorance of suffering but in triumph over it. The silence was broken, songs returned, not as they had been before, but deeper, richer, informed by sacrifice. The angels had learned something irreversible. Love was more powerful than force, obedience more costly than action, victory more profound when achieved through surrender. And now they wait again, not in confusion, not in restraint, but in readiness. The story continues on earth, carried by human voices, echoed by angelic watchfulness. The cross is empty, the tomb is vacant, the King lives. The ascension did not empty the earth of meaning, it filled it with responsibility. When the Son of God vanished from human sight, he did not withdraw his presence, he redefined it. The angels understood this immediately. They had watched him move between realms with effortless authority, and now they saw something unprecedented, humanity entrusted with a mission that would shape the rest of history. Heaven had acted, now earth would respond. In the days following the ascension, angels remained close, though unseen, as the disciples struggled to recalibrate their understanding of reality. Everything familiar had shifted. Death was no longer final. Fear no longer had the authority it once did. And yet, uncertainty lingered. The disciples had been given instructions, but not timelines. They were told to wait, and waiting had already proven to be one of the hardest commands they knew how to receive. Jerusalem became a place of tension once again. The city that had rejected the Son now held his followers in its grasp. Authorities were alert, rumors circulated. The story of an empty tomb could not be silenced, no matter how carefully it was managed. Angels observed the subtle movements of human fear and ambition, the same forces they had watched corrupt truth for centuries. But something was different now. Fear no longer had the final word. In an upper room, hearts gathered in obedience rather than certainty. Men and women who had once scattered under pressure now remained together, unified by shared experience and promise. Angels recognized the shift. This was not bravery born of confidence. It was endurance rooted in trust. The Son had said he would send help, and though they did not fully understand what that meant, they believed him enough to wait. When the moment arrived, heaven did not whisper, it moved. The outpouring of the Spirit was not subtle. Wind filled the room. Fire rested upon human heads without consuming them. Languages flowed where silence had lived. Angels witnessed this with reverent astonishment. They had always known the Spirit as active, powerful, present in creation and prophecy. But now, That same spirit took up residence within human beings, not visiting, indwelling. This was a transformation unlike any before it. Humanity was no longer merely guided by God from outside. God now lived within. The angels understood the strategic brilliance of this moment. The mission could not fail if the power behind it was internal rather than external. Persecution could scatter believers, but it could not remove the spirit. Death could silence a voice, but it could not extinguish truth once embedded in the human heart. The response was immediate and volatile. Crowds gathered, confused and curious. Accusations of madness followed awe. The pattern was familiar to the angels. Revelation always disrupts before it clarifies. Yet when Peter spoke, this same man who had once denied the Son in fear, the angels saw proof of transformation. His words carried weight not because of eloquence, but because of conviction forged through failure and restoration. As the gospel spread through Jerusalem, angels began to move more actively again, not as primary messengers, but as unseen guardians, redirecting danger, strengthening resolve, opening paths. Prison doors would open, chains would fall, not every time, not for every believer, but enough to ensure that the story continued forward. Angels understood that intervention was now selective, purposeful, aligned with mission rather than comfort. The cost of following the risen Son became clear quickly. Opposition hardened. Violence escalated. Stephen's death marked a painful turning point. Angels watched as the first martyr fell, his face reflecting peace rather than fear. They saw heaven open to receive him, the Son standing in honor. Death had lost its sting, but it had not lost its presence. Faith would now be tested in blood as well as belief. Yet persecution did not silence the movement, it accelerated it. Believers scattered, carrying the message beyond Jerusalem. Angels followed them into unfamiliar regions, crossing borders, cultures, and languages. The story was no longer contained within one nation. The commission was being fulfilled exactly as spoken. The gospel moved not as an army, but as a seed, small, overlooked, unstoppable. One man in particular drew angelic attention, Saul of Tarsus, brilliant, zealous, dangerous. He hunted the followers of the way with relentless precision. Angels had seen this kind of passion before, misdirected devotion fueled by certainty without humility. They knew the danger he posed. They also knew something else. God specializes in redirection. When light struck Saul on the road, angels recognized the pattern instantly. This was not punishment, it was interruption. Truth confronting error with undeniable clarity. Saul fell, blinded not by cruelty, but by revelation too bright to absorb all at once. The angels watched as the persecutor became the most relentless advocate of the very message he had tried to destroy. Another reversal, another testament to resurrection power extending beyond the tomb. As the years passed, the angels observed the church grow in unexpected ways. Leadership emerged from fishermen and former criminals. Communities formed across ethnic and social divides that had stood for centuries. The message adapted without changing, translated without losing power. The angels saw the genius of the plan unfold. God was not building an empire, he was building a body. Yet the mission was not without confusion. Disagreements arose, doctrine was debated, mistakes were made. Angels did not intervene to prevent every error. Growth required struggle. Faith matured through friction. The Son had not promised ease, he had promised presence, and that presence proved sufficient, even when clarity lagged behind obedience. As believers faced imprisonment, exile, and death, angels remained near. Sometimes they delivered, sometimes they strengthened, sometimes they simply witnessed. Their role was not to eliminate suffering, but to ensure that suffering never silenced hope. They understood now what they had only glimpsed at the cross. Love does not always remove pain. Sometimes it redeems it. From heaven's perspective, the centuries that followed were not chaotic. They were purposeful. Every generation received the same invitation, to believe, to follow, to carry the story forward. Some accepted, some rejected. The pattern remained unchanged. Angels watched empires rise and fall, laws change, languages evolve. Through it all, the gospel persisted, carried by ordinary people infused with extraordinary purpose. The cross and resurrection had altered the trajectory of existence. The ascension had activated a movement that could not be confined to geography or time. Angels, once the primary intermediaries between heaven and earth, now served quietly alongside a redeemed humanity. The partnership was intentional. The story was no longer just watched, it was lived. And as history moved forward, angels waited again, not for another sacrifice, but for a return. The Son had ascended with a promise. He would come again. Until that moment, heaven and earth would work in tandem, unseen and seen, bound together by a victory already secured and a future already written. Time did not dilute the impact of the resurrection. It amplified it. As centuries unfolded, the angels observed a slow but relentless transformation of the world, not through spectacle, but through persistence. The message of a crucified and risen king did not dominate by force. It advanced through whispered prayers, broken lives restored, and ordinary people choosing faith over fear. From heaven's vantage point, this was not disorder, it was strategy. The angels learned to measure progress differently than humans did. Empires still rose and fell with familiar arrogance. Cities expanded, collapsed, and were rebuilt under new names. Wars continued, blood continued to stain the ground, yet beneath the noise of history, something irreversible had taken root. The cross had planted a truth that could not be uprooted, no matter how violently the surface world resisted it. Wherever the message spread, angels followed, not to draw attention to themselves, but to guard the fragile beginnings of faith. In prison cells, they stood watch as believers sang instead of screamed. In deserts and forests, they observed solitary figures clinging to hope when community had been stripped away. Sometimes they intervened dramatically, breaking chains or redirecting danger. More often, they did not. They had learned that endurance was often a greater testimony than escape. One of the hardest lessons for angels was accepting how freely humans could reject what had cost heaven so much. They had witnessed the price of redemption. They had seen the Son bleed, suffocate, and surrender his spirit. To see that sacrifice ignored, mocked, or traded for comfort was bewildering. Yet they also began to understand something deeper. Love, to remain love, must allow refusal. Forced allegiance was not victory. Chosen devotion was. The world did not move steadily toward light. It lurched, hesitated, rebelled, returned. Faith was sometimes embraced by rulers and then corrupted by power. Other times it was. Driven underground, surviving in whispers and symbols etched into walls. The angels watched both with equal attention. Public triumph carried danger. Hidden faith carried purity. God worked through both, never abandoning his purpose. As doctrine developed and scriptures were gathered, angels observed debates that shaped belief for generations. They watched humans struggle to articulate mysteries. Angels themselves did not fully grasp. How could God be fully sovereign and humans genuinely free? How could suffering coexist with love? How could a single death echo across all time? These questions were not signs of doubt. They were evidence of minds stretching toward truth. Angels did not despise the struggle. They honored it. There were moments when the church reflected heaven beautifully, selfless, unified, radiant with compassion. And there were moments when it mirrored the worst of human nature, divided, violent, obsessed with control. Angels did not abandon their watch during either season. They understood that the story was not about perfection in this age. It was about direction. The trajectory mattered more than the stumbles. Throughout history, certain individuals caught angelic attention not because of fame, but because of faithfulness. Unknown believers who never preached to crowds, never wrote words preserved by history, yet lived lives so aligned with the heart of God that heaven leaned close. Angels recognized these souls instantly. They were reminders that the kingdom advanced not only through movements, but through moments, acts of kindness unseen, prayers uttered in silence, forgiveness chosen against instinct. Darkness adapted as well. Opposition grew more subtle, less overtly violent, more persuasive. Lies learned to sound reasonable. Truth became negotiable. Angels observed this shift with concern but not fear. Deception had always been part of the battle. What changed was the battlefield. It moved from open persecution to internal compromise. The danger was no longer only external threats, but internal erosion. Still, the promise held. The Son had said he would be with his followers always, and angels saw the evidence everywhere. In hospital rooms where hope should have died, in refugee camps where despair should have won, in places where the name of Jesus was spoken at great personal cost. The presence was not always dramatic, but it was constant. Angels learned that God's faithfulness did not depend on circumstances. It endured through them. As technology advanced and the world shrank, angels watched the message move faster than ever before. Words once carried by foot and ship now traveled at the speed of light. Access multiplied, so did distraction. Never had so many heard the story, and never had so many ignored it simultaneously. This paradox fascinated the angels. Opportunity expanded, but so did resistance. The harvest was plentiful, but the laborers still few. Yet heaven was not anxious. God had never been threatened by scale. The plan did not depend on universal approval. It depended on faithfulness. Angels remembered the cross, a moment that appeared to be total defeat, yet proved to be absolute victory. Appearances had always been misleading. History would prove no different. As generations came and went, angels noticed a growing hunger beneath the noise. Comfort had not satisfied. Progress had not answered the deepest questions. Humanity continued to search for meaning, identity, and hope. The answers were still the same as they had been at the tomb. He is not here. He is risen. Life is not found in what can be controlled, but in who has already overcome. Angels also became increasingly aware of the approaching convergence of history. Patterns repeated, promises layered, prophecies aligned. The same scriptures that spoke of suffering and resurrection also spoke of return. The Son would come again, not in humility, but in glory, not to suffer, but to reign. This time, angels would not be restrained. They would accompany him openly. Until that moment, their role remained watchful and active in quiet ways. They guarded children unaware of danger. They redirected paths that would have ended prematurely. They strengthened the weary who felt abandoned. Often unnoticed, almost always uncredited. It was enough. Their joy was not in recognition, but in participation. The story that began with creation, passed through a cross, and erupted in resurrection was still unfolding, chapter by chapter, life by life. Angels had learned something profound through it all. God's greatest works are rarely loud at first. They begin in obscurity, endure misunderstanding, and only later reveal their full magnitude. And so heaven waits again, not idle, not uncertain, but expectant. The King who conquered death will return. The silence will break one final time. And when it does, the angels will move, not to observe, but to proclaim that the story, long told and often ignored, has reached its appointed end. There is a moment in every long story when the weight of what has already happened begins to press against what is still to come. For the angels, that moment arrived not with thunder or fire, but with recognition. They began to see the shape of the ending forming far in advance, like a horizon slowly emerging through mist. The resurrection had guaranteed it. The ascension had confirmed it. History was no longer wandering, it was moving. From their vantage point beyond time's constraints, angels observed the human world accelerating. Knowledge multiplied, borders blurred, voices grew louder. Yet clarity did not keep pace with information. Humanity learned how to reach farther than ever before, but not how to rest. Progress solved problems while creating new ones, and beneath it all, the ancient ache remained unchanged. Angels recognized it immediately. It was the same hunger they had seen in Eden after exile, in Babel after ambition, in Jerusalem after rejection, the desire to belong, the fear of meaninglessness, the resistance to surrender. The story of the risen Son continued to move through this tension. Some received it with humility, others reshaped it to suit their preferences. Angels watched truth bent, diluted, commercialized, politicized. Yet they also watched it endure in its purest form, carried quietly by those who loved God more than influence. The contrast was sharp. Loud faith often drew attention. Quiet faith often carried power. As moral lines blurred, angels observed a familiar pattern re-emerge. Humanity struggled again with the oldest temptation, to define good and evil independently of God. It was not rebellion marked by open defiance, but by subtle redefinition. Words changed meaning, convictions softened into preference, truth became personal rather than eternal. Angels understood the danger immediately. When truth becomes negotiable, deception no longer needs to hide. Still, God did not withdraw. He had never retreated from broken worlds. Instead, he pressed closer, drawing hearts through conscience, conviction, and longing. Angels were dispatched to assist in ways unseen, nudging decisions, delaying disasters, creating moments where reflection could break through distraction. Many humans would never realize how close they came to irreversible outcomes, or how often mercy intervened quietly. The followers of the risen Son lived within this growing tension. They were no longer persecuted uniformly, nor embraced universally. They were tolerated, ignored, opposed, imitated, misunderstood. Angels noticed the fatigue settling into many faithful lives. Waiting is harder when hope is real, but fulfillment delayed. The promise of return sustained them, but time tested their endurance. Faith had become less about dramatic stands and more about daily perseverance. In this season, angels paid particular attention to suffering that did not resolve quickly. Chronic illness, lingering injustice, long prayers that seemed unanswered. These were not failures of faith, they were crucibles. Angels had learned at the cross that love does not always prevent pain. Often, it transforms it from meaningless suffering into shared endurance. God did not rush to remove every burden. He walked with those who carried them. The tension between heaven's certainty and earth's confusion grew sharper as the world's systems became increasingly fragile. Economic structures wavered. Trust in leadership eroded. Fear found new expressions. Angels recognized these shifts not as signs of imminent collapse but as contractions, birth pains rather than death throes. History was moving toward something, not away from it. Prophecies once considered distant or symbolic began to feel uncomfortably near. Patterns aligned. Conflicts echoed ancient tensions. Humanity revisited old mistakes with modern tools. Angels did not panic. They remembered how the cross had looked like ultimate defeat and proved to be ultimate victory. Nearness does not equal threat when the outcome is already secured. What troubled the angels most was not opposition, but indifference. Open hostility had always clarified choices. Apathy blurred them. When meaning is drowned in noise, truth must work harder to be heard. Angels watched countless lives filled with motion but devoid of direction. They saw humans distract themselves from eternity with temporary comforts, not realizing how close they stood to irreversible decisions. Yet even in this, hope persisted. Revival did not always arrive as mass movement. Sometimes it emerged as individual awakening, a single heart pierced by conviction, a quiet repentance, a renewed surrender. Angels celebrated these moments with joy disproportionate to their visibility. Heaven had always valued repentance over recognition. As the world edged closer to its appointed culmination, angels became more attentive than ever. Activity increased, not because the plan was failing, but because its final phase was approaching. They guarded those whose faith would be tested severely. They strengthened those who would stand when standing cost everything. They watched as lines were drawn, not by governments alone, but within hearts. The name of the risen Son became increasingly divisive, not because it changed, but because neutrality became impossible. Angels understood this dynamic well. Light does not create division, it reveals it. As clarity increased, so did resistance. Darkness does not surrender quietly. The promise of return loomed larger now. Angels knew it was not symbolic. They had seen the Son ascend bodily. They knew he would return the same way. This time, however, the silence that preceded his arrival would not be long. Heaven would not restrain itself. The restraint that defined the cross would give way to revelation on a scale never before witnessed. For now, the waiting continued, but it was different from before. This was not waiting in confusion, nor in grief. It was waiting with assurance. Every delay served mercy. Every moment extended was another opportunity for repentance, another chance for life to choose life. Angels understood the patience of God better now. They had watched him endure rejection, humiliation, and death without abandoning love. As history pressed forward, angels remained stationed across the world, unseen witnesses to the final unfolding of a story older than creation itself. They had watched the beginning. They had witnessed the turning point. They would soon see the conclusion. And when that moment arrived, it would not feel like interruption. It would feel like fulfillment. The silence before the end is never empty. It is crowded with purpose, layered with intention, saturated with patience stretched to its limit. Angels understood this better now than at any other point in their existence. They had lived through silences before, the hush before creation, the stillness after the cross, the pause before resurrection. But this one carried a different weight. This silence was mercy holding the door open for the last time. From heaven's perspective, history was no longer unfolding in broad strokes, but in fine details. Every choice mattered more. Every response carried greater consequence. The angels sensed it in the way time itself seemed compressed, as though moments were being drawn tighter together, accelerating toward a fixed conclusion. Humanity felt it too, though few could name it. Anxiety rose without clear cause. Longing deepened without clear direction. Something was coming. The question was no longer if, but when. Angels watched as the world grew louder yet less certain. Information flooded every space, but wisdom became rare. People knew more than ever and trusted less than ever. Authority fractured. Truth splintered into versions shaped by preference. The ancient serpent's strategy had matured. Lies no longer needed to deny truth. They only needed to dilute it. Angels recognized the danger immediately. Confusion can be more effective than opposition. Faith in this era required clarity of allegiance. It was no longer enough to admire the teachings of the risen Son or respect his influence. The question pressed harder now. Who is he to you? Angels observed how many hesitated at that threshold. Commitment demanded surrender, and surrender was the one thing modern humanity had been taught to avoid at all costs. Yet even here, grace persisted. Angels were sent to places no one celebrated, forgotten villages, hidden communities, isolated hearts. The gospel continued to move along unexpected paths. Where governments closed doors, dreams opened them. Where voices were silenced, whispers carried farther than shouts. Angels delighted in this quiet defiance of darkness. God's work had never required permission. Suffering increased in complexity. It was no longer only persecution for belief, but pressure to conform, to compromise, to remain silent. Many believers were not asked to renounce faith outright, but to redefine it until it meant nothing. Angels saw the toll this took. Martyrdom of the body had given way to erosion of conviction. Both required courage. One was dramatic, the other was daily. The angels paid close attention to those who endured without applause. Parents raising children in truth despite cultural hostility. Believers choosing integrity when dishonesty promised advancement. Souls clinging to prayer when answers delayed far longer than expected. These lives rarely made history books, but they shaped eternity. Heaven recorded what earth ignored. As resistance intensified, angels also observed a sharpening among those who truly belonged to the risen King. Faith matured, illusions fell away. Comfort was no longer confused with blessing. Many who once followed for protection now followed for truth, even when it cost them everything else. This refinement was painful, but necessary. What would stand at the end could not be built on convenience. The spiritual realm grew more active as well. Darkness pressed harder, sensing its time was short. Deception escalated, not randomly, but strategically. Confusion targeted identity, authority, and truth, the same fault lines exploited since the beginning. Angels recognized the pattern instantly. The enemy had not changed tactics, only packaging. Heaven responded not with panic, but precision. Angels were dispatched with increasing specificity. Not everywhere, not always visibly, but exactly where needed. A delayed accident, a redirected conversation, a moment of hesitation that saved a life. A word spoken at the precise instant a soul stood. On the edge of surrender. Many would never know how close they came to tragedy or transformation, but heaven knew. Prayer took on new intensity during this season, not because God had grown distant, but because awareness had sharpened. Angels moved constantly between realms, carrying intercession shaped by human desperation and hope. They recognized prayers that were rehearsed and prayers that were raw. Heaven responded to both, but something shifted when prayer became less about outcomes and more about alignment. Those prayers carried unusual authority. The promise of return loomed closer now. Angels spoke of it among themselves not as speculation, but as certainty approaching fulfillment. They remembered the moment of ascension clearly, the sun rising, blessing his followers, disappearing into glory. They also remembered the words spoken immediately after, "He will return in the same way." That promise had not aged, it had not weakened, it had only drawn nearer. Earth, however, remained divided. Some anticipated his return with longing, others mocked the idea openly. Many ignored it altogether. Angels understood this too. Delay had bred familiarity, and familiarity had dulled expectation. Yet delay was not denial. Mercy was the reason time continued. Judgment waited because love still invited. As global instability increased, angels noticed something else. Fear was losing its effectiveness. Not everywhere, but among those grounded in truth. Fear thrives on uncertainty. Faith thrives on promise. Those who truly believed the resurrection no longer feared death in the same way. They grieved, yes. They suffered, yes. But they did not despair. That distinction mattered more than any sermon. The closer the end drew, the clearer the contrast became. Light and darkness no longer blended easily. Choices carried visible weight. Neutral ground shrank. Angels watched humanity step more decisively into alignment, whether toward truth or away from it. The story was clarifying itself. And then there were moments, quiet, almost imperceptible, when heaven leaned forward collectively. Patterns aligned too precisely to ignore. Ancient words echoed current realities. The convergence was undeniable. Angels did not know the exact moment, but they knew the season. The long patience of God was nearing its fulfillment. Heaven prepared not for restraint, but for revelation. The same angels who had once stood silent at the cross now anticipated open proclamation. The next arrival of the Son would not be misunderstood. Every eye would see, every realm would acknowledge. The humility of the first coming would give way to the authority of the second. Until that moment, angels remained at their posts, watching, guarding, assisting, waiting, not in uncertainty, but in awe of a story so vast that even beings who had witnessed its every chapter still marveled at its depth. The silence thickened again, not with absence, but with imminence. The King was coming, and heaven was ready. The moment approached, not with warning sirens or cosmic countdowns, but with an unmistakable shift in authority. Angels felt it first. They had always been attuned to the movements of heaven, but this was different from anything they had experienced before. This was not preparation for restraint or waiting. This was alignment for arrival. Commands moved through the heavenly realm with precision and urgency, not frantic, not delayed, perfectly timed. For ages, angels had watched history bend toward this point. They had guarded children who would one day stand firm in faith. They had strengthened believers whose obedience would ripple farther than they ever knew. They had witnessed betrayals and revivals, collapse and renewal. Every event, every decision, every generation had been steering toward this convergence. Now, the long arc was reaching its final bend. Heaven began to organize itself openly. What had once been unseen preparation became deliberate positioning. Orders were clear, roles were assigned. The hierarchy of heaven, long accustomed to discipline, moved in flawless coordination. Angels who had once delivered quiet messages now prepared to proclaim undeniable truth. Those who had guarded in secret readied themselves to appear in glory. Silence, once an expression of mercy, was nearing its end. On earth, the signs were subtle to some and overwhelming to others. Instability no longer felt temporary. Crises overlapped without resolution. The systems humanity trusted most revealed their fragility. Confidence gave way to exhaustion. People sensed that something fundamental was breaking, but few could articulate what it was. Angels recognized the sensation immediately. It was not the collapse of civilization, it was the exposure of its limits. Faith in this moment became starkly revealing. Some clung harder to hope, refining belief into something resilient and unshakable. Others abandoned it entirely, choosing certainty and control rather than trust in promise. Angels observed both responses with clarity. They had seen this division before, though never at such scale. When truth draws near, neutrality dissolves. The followers of the risen king felt the pressure intensely. They were no longer sustained by momentum or tradition. Faith now required personal conviction. The cost of belief rose sharply, not always in blood, but in isolation, ridicule, and loss. Angels stood close to these souls, not removing the burden, but reinforcing resolve. Heaven honored endurance that refused to yield, even when reward seemed distant. Prayer changed in these days. It became less polished, more urgent. Fewer words, deeper cries. Angels carried these prayers swiftly, not because God had grown slow, but because hearts had grown honest. The prayers that mattered most were no longer about preservation of comfort, but about strength to remain faithful until the end. Heaven responded to those prayers with unusual intensity. As darkness pressed harder, it grew bolder. Deception no longer whispered, it declared. Truth was challenged openly, mocked publicly, reframed relentlessly. Angels understood this escalation. Lies grow loud when time is short. The enemy was not improvising, he was accelerating. Yet acceleration also revealed weakness. Desperation always does. Heaven's response was not chaos, but clarity. Angels were dispatched with specific assignments: to protect, to warn, to restrain destruction just long enough for mercy to reach one more soul. Every delay mattered. Every extension of time served a purpose. God's patience, stretched across centuries, was not exhausted. It was deliberate. Then came the moment angels had anticipated since the ascension. A command unlike any before it echoed through heaven. Not a whisper, not a test, a declaration. The waiting was complete. Mercy had extended its full measure. History had reached its appointed threshold. The sky would not open gradually. There would be no ambiguity, no room for reinterpretation. The return of the Son would not resemble his first arrival. He would not come hidden, vulnerable, or misunderstood. He would come revealed. The angels knew this truth with certainty, and they aligned themselves accordingly. When heaven began to move, it moved as one. The realms responded in unison. Power gathered not to destroy indiscriminately, but to restore order completely. Angels who had once watched humanity judge God, now prepared to witness God judge the world. This judgment was not impulsive. It was measured, just, and final. On earth, awareness would come too late for some, and just in time for others. The suddenness would shock, not because it was unexpected, but because it had been postponed for so long. Angels knew this paradox well. Humanity had mistaken patience for absence, silence for indifference, delay for denial. The arrival itself would fracture reality as humans understood it. The boundary between seen and unseen would collapse. The heavens would declare what earth had debated. Every lie would lose its scaffolding. Every truth would stand exposed. Angels understood the weight of this unveiling. It was not merely the end of an age. It was the vindication of every promise spoken since the beginning. Those who had waited in faith would not be disappointed. Angels had recorded their perseverance, their unseen obedience, their refusal to compromise when compromise was easy. These lives would not be forgotten. Heaven never forgets faithfulness, no matter how unnoticed it was on earth. Those who had rejected truth would also stand exposed, not condemned for ignorance, but for refusal. Angels knew the difference. Mercy had reached far, wide, and repeatedly. The finality of this moment was not cruelty, it was consequence. As the king prepared to return, angels experienced something close to anticipation fulfilled. They had served across eras, across covenants, across shifting phases of the plan. Now they would serve openly. No restraint, no silence. They would accompany the one they had worshipped before creation, now returning as conqueror, judge, and rightful ruler. The return would not erase suffering instantly, but it would end its dominion. Death would lose its authority completely. Injustice would no longer persist unanswered. The world would not be destroyed arbitrarily. It would be reclaimed intentionally. Angels knew the distinction mattered. As heaven advanced toward earth, the long story reached its crescendo. Every chapter that preceded this moment had been necessary. The cross, the tomb, the waiting, the endurance. None of it was wasted. All of it had led here. The silence broke, not with fear, but with glory. And the king was coming. When the king finally arrived, the universe did not struggle to recognize him. Creation had been waiting far longer than humanity realized. The heavens opened not reluctantly, but willingly, like doors fulfilling their original purpose. Light did not merely shine, it revealed. What had always been true, but long debated, now stood undeniable. The Son of God returned not as a silent sacrifice, but as rightful ruler, bearing authority earned through obedience, suffering, and love, taken to its furthest extreme. Angels moved with him, not in secrecy, but in splendor. No longer hidden messengers or unseen guardians. They were revealed as part of the great procession that accompanied the King of Kings. These were the same beings who had once stood frozen in obedience at the cross, who had watched nails driven into hands they had worshipped since before time. Now they moved freely, openly, their restraint fully lifted. Their joy was not triumph over humanity, but the fulfillment of justice long delayed and mercy fully offered. Earth responded as it had at the crucifixion, but this time not in mourning. The ground trembled again, not under the weight of death, but under the authority of life reclaiming what had been lost. The skies bore witness. The ocean stirred. The mountains, ancient and patient, stood as they had always stood, silent observers to God's unfolding purpose. Creation recognized its creator, returning not to suffer, but to restore. Humanity stood exposed in a way no generation before had experienced. Masks fell away, pretenses dissolved. There was no hiding behind systems, titles, beliefs inherited, but never lived. Every heart stood revealed not by accusation, but by truth itself. The angels watched closely, not with cruelty, but with clarity. This moment was not arbitrary. Every soul stood where it had chosen to stand over the course of a lifetime. For those who had waited in faith, often quietly, often painfully, the arrival was not terror, but relief. Long. Prayers answered not with explanations, but with presence. Tears shed in private were remembered publicly in heaven. Obedience that had seemed unseen was acknowledged fully. The angels saw joy erupt where endurance had once strained under silence. This was vindication, not of pride, but of trust. For others, the moment carried shock rather than wonder. Not because they had never heard the truth, but because they had postponed it indefinitely. Angels recognized the tragedy in this, not the judgment itself, but the realization that opportunity had been mistaken for permanence. Mercy had been abundant. Time had been generous. Refusal, however, had been decisive. The king did not return to negotiate truth. He returned to establish it. Justice flowed not as rage, but as order restored. Every wrong answered, every lie dismantled, every abuse of power exposed. Angels understood justice differently now than they had before the cross. It was no longer abstract righteousness. It was righteousness scarred by sacrifice. The one who judged bore wounds as testimony that judgment had not come cheaply. Death, long humanity's greatest fear, was finally stripped of authority. It did not vanish quietly. It was confronted, defeated, and rendered obsolete. Angels who had escorted souls beyond the veil for millennia now witnessed the end of that task. Life was no longer temporary. Separation no longer inevitable. Resurrection was no longer promise. It was reality fully realized. The earth itself began to change, not destroyed, but renewed. Corruption that had been tolerated for the sake of mercy now gave way to restoration. The curse that had fractured creation since Eden loosened its grip. Angels watched as harmony returned gradually, deliberately, in ways both visible and profound. This was not escape from the world. It was its redemption. The king's reign did not resemble human empires. There were no power struggles, no fear-driven obedience, no fragile systems propped up by force. Authority flowed naturally, unchallenged because it was unquestionably right. Peace did not require enforcement. Justice did not require defense. Love no longer competed with fear because fear had lost its leverage. Angels took their places within this restored order, not elevated above humanity, but alongside redeemed people who now stood as co-heirs with the Son. This partnership, once unimaginable, was now complete. Humans, once fragile and divided, now reflected the image they had been created to bear. The angels marveled at this more than anything else. Salvation had not merely rescued humanity, it had transformed it. Memories of the cross did not fade in this new age. They deepened. The wounds the King bore remained, not as symbols of suffering, but as emblems of love chosen freely. Every act of obedience, every sacrifice made in faith, every moment of endurance found its meaning there. Angels who had once struggled to understand the necessity of the cross now understood its centrality. Everything flowed from it, everything returned to it. Time itself felt different. Urgency gave way to fullness. The relentless pressure of decay and loss lifted. Joy did not depend on contrast with sorrow. It stood complete in itself. Angels who had existed outside human time now shared in a reality where time served life rather than eroded it. The story that had begun before creation, that had passed through rebellion, covenant, incarnation, death, and resurrection, reached its intended completion, not as an ending, but as fulfillment. The purpose for which angels had been created, for which humanity had been formed, stood revealed in perfect clarity. God dwelling with his people, creation restored, love unopposed, and yet wonder did not cease. Eternity did not stagnate. Life continued to unfold, rich with discovery, meaning, and relationship. Angels and humans alike continued to learn, not about suffering, but about the depth of God's nature, the endless creativity of love. Unrestricted by loss. Looking back, the angels remembered the silence at the cross. They remembered the restraint, the waiting, the confusion. They now understood that silence had not been absence. It had been the most profound expression of trust ever required of them. The obedience that once felt unbearable now shone as part of a story too vast to grasp at the time. The question that had once echoed through heaven, "What are we to do while the Son suffers?" now had its answer. They had obeyed, they had waited, and in doing so, they had witnessed the greatest victory ever achieved. The King reigned, the story endured, and the universe, once fractured by sin and sorrow, now rested in the presence of love made complete.